Imagine you're running a country like you'd run your career. If you're already a software engineer, your next move probably isn't become a professional ballet dancer. It's more likely data scientist or ML engineer. You move into things that are related to what you already do. Countries behave the same way. If a country exports textiles, it's much easier to move into clothing, then into technical fabrics, than to jump straight into rocket engines. And if it exports crude oil, it's much easier to expand into petrochemicals than into quantum computers. Economists call this pattern the principle of relatedness. Economies diversify into activities that are related to ones they already do. Now, here's the big question. If this move into related stuff rule drives short-term changes year by year, what does that imply for the long-term path of development over decades? A new paper in Nature Communications tackles exactly that. The title is Bridging the Short-Term and Long-Term Dynamics of Economic Structural Change by James McNerney, Yang Li, Andres Gomez-Lievano, and Frank Neffke. Let's unpack what they did, in both plain language and a bit of nerd mode. First, they treat an economy as a kind of fingerprint, a list of activities or products, and how good the country is at each one. Think of it as a vector of abilities across all possible industries. Next, they build a network that connects products. Two products sit close together in this network when many countries tend to export them together. Cloth garments and knitwear are close. Potatoes and precision optics, not so much. This network captures relatedness. If you're already good at one product, it's easier to move into its neighbors. Then they let abilities spread along this network over time. If a country is strong in one product, that strength can diffuse into nearby products, while activities that sit far away remain hard to reach. Mathematically, they use a tool called a graph Laplacian, which is the same kind of operator that describes diffusion, heat flow, or consensus in networks. But you don't need the equations to get the idea. Strength in one area bleeds into related areas over time. Here's where the dynamics get interesting. If you analyze this system with eigenmode decomposition, think of it as finding the main directions in which the system naturally wants to evolve. You find that the long-run behavior is dominated by just a couple of very slow modes. Translated, in the long run, economies mostly move along a few big, smooth directions in this huge space of industries, not in all directions equally. Out of this, the authors extract two key coordinates. The first one is called A. You can think of A as a kind of averageability across products. When you compute it on real data, A lines up strongly with how diverse a country's export basket is. Higher A means you export more different products competitively. The second coordinate is called B. This one is all about composition, the mix of what you export. When you look at the values of B across products, one side is dominated by agricultural and resource-heavy goods, while the other side is dominated by manufactured and more advanced goods. So on one axis, A, you have, how many different things do we do? On the other axis, B, you have, what kind of things do we do, basic or advanced? Now the authors take this framework to the data. They use UN Comtrade exports for around 249 countries over more than 50 years, from the early 1960s to 2018. For each country and year, they compute A and B and plot everybody on this two-dimensional plane. What do they see? Poor, undiversified economies sit in the bottom left corner. Low A, low B. They export few products, mostly agricultural or raw resources. As these economies develop, they tend to move up and to the right. Their A increases as they diversify into more products. Their B increases as their export mix shifts from agriculture toward manufacturing, and eventually into more complex goods. This path reproduces a classic story in development economics. The move from agriculture to manufacturing, and eventually to services. It echoes the so-called Kuznets facts about structural change, but now you can see it in a clean, two-dimensional map driven by a simple dynamic rule. Rich, diversified economies, like many OECD countries, cluster in the upper right, high A and moderately high B. They produce and export a lot of different things, including many higher-value manufactured goods. Then you have another group, rich but undiversified economies. Think of oil-heavy producers or some tax havens. They can have high incomes but low A. They're strong in a narrow set of activities. Over time, these economies tend to drift in ways that reduce how extreme their specialization is. So far, this is already neat. A very simple model of move into related stuff explains decades of global structural change. But the really provocative part involves economic complexity metrics. If you've seen things like the Economic Complexity Index, the ECI, or the Fitness Index, they're usually presented as sophisticated tools to infer how many hidden capabilities a country has. They're supposed to pick up the deep, latent complexity of an economy from the pattern of what it exports. What this paper shows is that when you compare those complexity metrics to the A and B coordinates, they fall into two families. Metrics like fitness, production ability, and some entropic measures all line up with A. They mostly tell you about diversity, how many different products a country exports with strength. Metrics like the Economic Complexity Index line up with B. They mostly tell you where the country sits along that agriculture to manufacturing and beyond axis. So instead of all these indices measuring a single true complexity, they're actually summarizing two different aspects of structural change: diversity and composition. That means ECI and fitness are not rivals in a beauty contest. They're complementary projections of the same underlying dynamic process. ECI tells you where you are along a long-run development direction. Fitness tells you how broad your activity portfolio is. And here's the kicker. These metrics might not really be measuring complexity in the abstract at all. They might be better understood as compact descriptions of how far along a typical development path a country has moved. That interpretation also explains some weird rankings. For example, oil often shows up as low complexity, while pottery and artwork sometimes show up as high complexity. If you take those literally, it sounds wrong. Oil extraction is technically demanding. But if the metric is really capturing structural change, not difficulty, it makes sense. Economies tend to diversify away from oil as they develop, while artisan goods are more common in richer, more diversified economies that can afford them. So what does this all mean in practice? First, it unifies two big strands of the economic complexity field: short-term diversification and long-term complexity metrics. They turn out to be different timescales of the same story. Second, it gives policymakers a more intuitive dashboard. Instead of staring at a single number like ECI, they can look at movement in A and movement in B. Are we diversifying? And are we shifting into activities that correlate with higher incomes? Third, it opens the door to better models. The principle of relatedness is a strong pattern, but it's not the whole story. Countries sometimes make big jumps into unrelated sectors through policy, foreign investment, or technology transfer. You can now plug those kinds of jumps into this dynamic framework and see how they change a country's trajectory on the A-B map. In short, this paper takes a messy jungle of metrics and turns it into a simple, dynamic map of how economies learn. If you're into development economics, network science, or data-driven policy, it's a great example of how one clean modeling idea, diversify into related activities, can connect short-term changes, long-term structural transformation, and the complexity scores people already use. If you're not a specialist, the takeaway is simpler. Countries don't level up at random. They climb through a network of related capabilities, and the footprints of that climb are what many complexity metrics are really capturing. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown of economic structural change and want more deep dives into science, tech, and the future of the economy, check out more at newswade.com.